What's up guys, and welcome back to Retro Gamer Gen X's Retro Gaming channel. And in today's video, we're going to be checking out the history of the 4th generation of video game consoles like the Sega Genesis here behind me. Now these are the consoles that went from the 8-bit generation up to the 16-bit generation and gave us faster processing, faster games, better graphics, just a whole bunch of different enhancements to the whole gaming scene. It just made everything so much different. But at the end of every year, I put these history compilation videos together. Basically what they are is just all my history and all my look at videos through the years put together along with the ones that I've done this year, added into the mix. And really what my goal is to make the biggest video game history videos here on YouTube that anybody can come and see and actually learn about these great retro video game consoles. So without further ado guys, let's go ahead and check out the 4th generation of video game consoles.
First, there was Atari. Then, there was Nintendo.
Now, the next generation video games, TurboGrafx 16 and TurboGrafx CD for live video games and 2,000 times more memory. Turbo Express Portable, Turbo Chip compatibility, basic system $99.99. TurboGrafx 16, the next generation now.
The story of the NEC, PC Engine, and TurboGrafx 16 starts in the early 1980s. NEC, also known as Nippon Electronic Company, a communications company at the time, started getting into the home personal computing market. They developed a computer called the PC-88. By 1981, the PC-88 held 40% of Japan's personal computing market, and just like any other personal computer of the time, video games were a major portion of its market share. In 1982, Nintendo contacted NEC to help develop games for their upcoming Famicom system. The first few games developed for the Famicom were developed on the PC-88 because Nintendo hadn't completed their development kit yet. By working with Nintendo, NEC got the itch to get into the gaming market. They worked with a third-party developer, Hudson Soft, to acquire a license to port some of the Nintendo games over to the PC-88, including Excite Bike, Balloon Fight, Tennis, Golf, and Ice Climber. They even created 3 new Nintendo games just for the system: Super Mario Bros. Special, Punch Ball Mario Bros., and Donkey Kong 3. NEC really wanted to get into the gaming market at this time, but were afraid because of the video game crash and seeing other game companies fail. They watched the Famicom in Japan and the NES around the world become a huge success for Nintendo. They also saw Sega starting to have success as well, and they knew it was time to get into the market. By this time, NEC had released a PC-98, which was a 16-bit microcomputer and eventually evolved into a 32-bit machine. This gave NEC an advantage as they were already working within the 16-bit realm. By 1986, Hudson and NEC partnered up to start development of a new video game system. Earlier, Hudson had contacted Nintendo to try and sell them the advanced chipset for their next video game console, but Nintendo declined, so Hudson found a new partner in NEC. Hudson had developed an 8-bit CPU that essentially was the same as the 65 CO2 processor. They coupled this processor with 2 16-bit graphic processors, the first one being the video display controller and the second being the video color encoder. Development of the console was quick due to most of the hardware already being completed. NEC already had software support from Hudson, but also brought in other third-party developers such as Namco and Konami to develop games for the system. They released the PC Engine on October 30th, 1987 in Japan. It instantly became a hit, selling more than 500,000 units in the first week, taking the lead in the Japanese gaming market. The system had good quality games from great third-party developers, a small but elegant design, and had a small compact credit card-sized game cartridge called a HuCard. With the success that NEC was having with the PC Engine, most would think that this would be the end of the story. However, it was just the beginning. NEC decided that they were going to do 2 things in 1988. 1, they would expand the market to North America, and 2, they would create a new CD-ROM add-on for the PC Engine. Development of the North American PC Engine started. However, it was found that Americans like things big and not small, so they decided to make the console bigger. Also, the name PC Engine was not very popular with the polls taken in America, so they decided to name the new system the TurboGrafx 16, based off its 16-bit video chip architecture. But development of the system was a slow process and delayed the release in North America. Meanwhile, in Japan, development of the CD-ROM was moving along quickly, and by December of 1988, it was released. This made the PC Engine the very first video game console to use the CD-ROM media format. They sold over 60,000 units in the first 5 months, and by the end of the third fiscal quarter of 1989, sold more than 80,000 CD-ROM units, and 1.2 million PC Engine consoles. By mid-1989, development of the North American TurboGrafx 16 had been completed, and the consoles were beginning to be produced. It launched in August of 1989 in limited quantities in Los Angeles and New York test markets. Unfortunately for NEC, this was 2 weeks after Sega launched the Genesis in America with the arcade hit Altered Beast packed in. Unlike NEC, Sega didn't waste time redesigning the console for the American market and launched it as quickly as they could with a great pack-in game, while NEC wasted almost 2 years for the Americanized console to be developed and packed in the game Keith Courage in Alpha Zones, which really nobody in North America was familiar with. The TurboGrafx 16 add-on released shortly after, but was priced at $399 by itself and no pack-in games. Because of all this, unlike the Japanese market, Sega dominated NEC in North America. Making matters worse, in NEC's contract, Hudson got paid for each console that was produced, sold or not, and they made 750,000 units in the stagnant North American market, costing NEC millions. Now, over in Japan, things were a lot different. In fact, sales of the PC Engine were skyrocketing, and they launched 3 new models of the PC Engine in 1989. The first called the PC Engine Core Graphics. Other than a slightly updated CPU and the addition of composite AV instead of RF video, it was essentially the same as the PC Engine, just with a different color scheme being black and blue instead of white and red, and it had an updated controller with turbo capabilities. The second model was the PC Engine Super Graphics, which was an enhanced PC Engine with upgraded RAM, a second video display controller, and a video display processor to combine the VDCs. It also had an updated CPU. However, the system was quite expensive and was not very popular. Only 5 exclusive games were released for it, and it was soon canceled. The third model was the PC Engine Shuttle. It was a cost-reduced version of the PC Engine targeted towards children, and it was shaped somewhat like a spaceship. In fact, if you look closely, I think Atari took some design cues from this for their Atari Jaguar. This also had AV out, with the main difference being it had no expansion port, so it could not be connected to the CD-ROM add-on. This model was somewhat successful in Japan and was also distributed in South Korea. Also in 1989, NEC released a PC Engine in Europe, starting with France. It was a well-liked console in France, with major retailers selling the console. But by this time, NEC was seeing the TurboGrafx 16 in North America not being successful, and decided to cancel the rest of the European launch. The units that were produced for the UK were North American units converted to PAL. NEC sold this inventory to distributors. Telegames released the console in 1990 in very limited quantities. In 1990, NEC released another new model of the PC Engine, but this time it was to take your games on the go. The PC Engine GT was released in Japan on December 1st, 1990, and then in the United States as the Turbo Express. It was a portable version of the PC Engine with a backlit 2.6-inch LCD screen, which at the time was way more advanced than Nintendo's Game Boy. However, because of its high price and its short battery life, it didn't do too well in the market. NEC was way ahead of its time, looking at the success of the Nintendo Switch now. Speaking of Nintendo, the Super Famicom launched in Japan on November of 1990, giving NEC true competition with Nintendo for the first time. By mid-1991, NEC had finally sold the 750,000 units that were produced in 1989 in North America. But on a positive note, worldwide they had sold over 500,000 CD-ROM units. In June, NEC released the Core Graphics 2. They put the original HU-C6280 CPU back into the unit and changed the case colors again. Nintendo released the SNES in North America in August. In September, NEC releases the PC Engine Duo in Japan. This combines the PC Engine and the CD-ROM all in one unit. Once again, this unit becomes successful in Japan. In December, NEC releases two new products in Japan. The Super CD-ROM, which had an updated BIOS, increased RAM to 256 kilobits, and was able to directly connect to the back of the PC Engine without an adapter. They also released the PC Engine LT, which was a PC Engine in a laptop form factor with an attached screen. It did not have its own battery, so you had to plug it in for power. Not too many of these consoles were made, and they're very rare today. By mid-1992, NEC and Hudson had agreed to transfer management in North America over to a joint venture called Turbo Technologies Incorporated. This was a move to try to remarket the TurboGrafx 16 in North America. In October, they released the Turbo Duo in North America, but by this time, they faced stiff competition with Nintendo and Sega, which were currently dominating the market. The numbers don't lie, and the TurboGrafx 16 and the Turbo Duo just were not successful outside of Japan. In Japan, the PC Engine Duo was selling well. In fact, two updated versions were made, the PC Engine Duo R, released in 1993, and the PC Engine Duo RX in 1994. These consoles essentially had cosmetic changes from the original, but the RX included a new 6-button controller. By the end of 1994, things were definitely taking a toll on NEC. The lucrative gaming market that they had held a lead in the market share in Japan initially had faded long away. Nintendo and Sega were dominating the market, and a newcomer Sony was on the horizon. NEC discontinued the PC Engine and TurboGrafx 16 in 1994 in North America, Japan, and France. And at this point, Turbo Technologies Incorporated discontinued the Turbo Duo in North America as well, while in Japan, the PC Engine Duo lasted another year until 1995. But amazingly, the last licensed game for the PC Engine was Dead on the Brain Part 1 and 2, which was released on June 3, 1999 in the Super CD format. The PC Engine was released in 1987 and the TurboGrafx in 1989. They were completely discontinued by 1995, giving the console an 8-year lifespan and being the first video game console to use the CD-ROM media format.
And so it was, late in the 20th century, that a pox fell upon the land, a plague of home videos that were limited in intelligence. There was brain drain, and terminal boredom swept the countryside. The maker looked down and was not pleased by what he saw, and said, "This is not good." And so it was, he brought forth Genesis, a system with twice the power, twice the intelligence, twice the challenge, twice the fun. Only a chosen few were called forth to experience this new dimension of high-definition graphics and stereo sound. And the maker saw what he had done and said, "Now that's not bad. Discover Genesis, and your world will never be the same."
The story of the Sega Genesis actually started in the early 1980s. Sega's arcade sales were starting to slump, and they saw the need to get into the home console market. The push to get into the home console market was led by Sega Enterprises Limited president Oyoya Nakayama. In 1983, Sega released the SG-1000 in Japan, but the system didn't fare well against Nintendo's Famicom. In 1984, Sega arranged a buyout of their owner, Gulf and Western, which Sega was a subsidiary of. Nakayama was named president of the newly formed Sega Enterprises. Within 2 years of the SG-1000's release, Sega released another console named the Mark III. Now we all in North America know the Mark III as the Sega Master System, which was released here in the United States in 1986 to compete with the Nintendo in the American market. However, just like in Japan unfortunately, the Master System wasn't very successful, which Sega already anticipated, and within just a few days of launching the Master System in the United States, work already began on a new console. With two of Sega's best R&D engineers at the helm, Hideki Sato and Masumi Ishikawa. In 1987, another stroke of bad luck hit Sega. NEC, one of Japan's biggest electronic companies, decided to launch the PC Engine. Sega at this point saw the need for a 16-bit system because of the release of the PC Engine. and rumors of a 16-bit console being developed by Nintendo. So the decision was made by Ishikawa to develop a system with a 16-bit microprocessor and a second 8-bit Zilog coprocessor to help take the load off the main processor for the system sound. The exterior of the console was designed to emulate the look of audio equipment at the time, and also the interior of automobiles. This decision was made to distance itself from toy-looking consoles, hoping to attract older consumers. The Mega Drive was released in Japan on October 29, 1988. Unfortunately for Sega, its release was 1 week after the Super Mario Bros. 3 game was released on the Nintendo. And with the PC Engine being very popular in Japan as well, Sega was running a distant third in the console race. Sega now knew at this point it needed to act in North America, and fast. Tonka, the American toy company, was distributing the Master System for the Sega at the time, but Sega was not impressed by their marketing tactics. So for the Sega Genesis distribution, they decided to seek help from another company. Sega then contacted Atari and made a proposal with CEO Jack Tramiel, but Tramiel refused the offer, instead deciding to work on the Atari ST line of computers. So at this point, Sega basically said screw everybody and opened its own Sega of America division to handle marketing and distribution of the Sega Genesis. The Genesis launched to a limited market just like the NES did previously. This was done to test the American market before the full release. It was launched in New York City and Los Angeles on August 14, 1989. Due to the successful sales of the console, it was released to the rest of the United States later that year in several batches. Sega in different parts of the world decided to distribute the console through different companies as well. It was released in Europe and Brazil in September of 1990, and in other parts of the world with different distributors on various dates. Marketing in North America was handled by former Atari Corporation Entertainment Electronics Division President Michael Katz. He wanted to market the system for its arcade-like gameplay and graphics, and came up with the slogan, "Genesis does what Nintendo don't." But by mid-1990, Katz did not reach the sales goal set by Nakayama for 1 million units sold, and only 500,000 were sold. So at this point, Nakayama fired and replaced him with Tom Kalinske. He saw that Nintendo was successful with having iconic video game characters like Mario and wanted to repeat that kind of success. At this point, Sega's mascot was Alex the Kid. Although popular in Japan, in North America, nobody really knew him and didn't relate to the character. Sonic was made to show the speed and graphic capabilities of the Genesis, along with being a cool character, as Sega was trying to reach a cooler crowd of gamers. The strategy worked and sales of the Genesis increased. Other marketing techniques were put in place, like reducing the cost of the console, hiring developers that targeted American audiences, and a very aggressive ad campaign. Sega was also successful in creating different add-ons for the system, with the addition of the power-based converter, the 32X, and the Sega CD. The Genesis had reached the 32-bit and CD-ROM game market, and having backward capability to the Master System helped sales of the older Master System games as well. Sega also showed their hand in the rating system for video games. In the early to mid-1990s, watchdog groups were condemning video games for the violence that they portrayed. Sega even went to congressional hearings because of games like Mortal Kombat and Night Trap during these proceedings. The video game rating system was set up by December of 1994 and was being put on video games. But since there was a rating system now, Sega decided to release Mortal Kombat 2 completely uncensored and not having to use a code to get the blood or fatalities. They were really the first to test the system, and it worked, as we can see by games that are released today. Sega discontinued the Genesis in 1997, selling over 30 million units worldwide. Another 4.5 million units were sold by other distribution companies worldwide as well, bringing the total to about 35 million consoles, with most of these sales being in North America and in Europe. Sega finally achieved success in the home console market, with help of great marketing and one little hedgehog.
Oh, you guys are still here. Well, if you dig the content, go ahead and hit that like, that subscribe, and that notification bell. That way you guys get notifications every time I drop new content like this. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get back to this game here. Why don't you guys get back to the video?
When you decide to step up to this kind of power, this kind of challenge, this kind of flying, crashing feeling, when you decide to get serious, there's only one place to come: the games of Super Nintendo. No one else creates this kind of experience, because no one else creates these kinds of games. Now you're playing with power, superpower.
The story of the SNES starts in 1987. A newcomer to the gaming industry, NEC, had just released the 16-bit PC engine in Japan. Nintendo's president, Hiroshi Yamauchi, had seen NEC and its product as a strong competitor to the NES, which started to worry Nintendo. At this point, sales of the NES were still great, but Yamauchi knew this would not last long with the great graphics and sound that the PC engine was able to produce. Also in 1987, it was announced that Sega was about to launch their 16-bit system, the Mega Drive. In September of 1987, Nintendo announced the development of the Super Famicom and a new Super Mario Bros. 4 game. The system was being developed by none other than Masayuki Uemura, who had developed the NES. Nintendo at this time was worried more about the NEC than Sega. The reason for this is that Sega had released a few consoles in the 8-bit era, but were completely overshadowed by the Famicom and the NES. Nintendo was really not in a hurry to develop the new 16-bit system because sales of the NES were still going good. However, this did not last long. Some feel Nintendo made this announcement in 1987 to stall sales of the PC Engine during the Christmas season. In 1988, Sega released the Mega Drive, and the PC Engine was picking up steam as well. NES sales started to slump, and Nintendo knew they had to get a new system on the market. Development went into full swing, but since Nintendo was so late to the game, it took a couple years to develop. The first prototypes of the system were shown to the public in 1988, and again before its launch in Japan in 1989. In 1989, both Sega and NEC had released their systems in North America, but changed the names to TurboGrafx-16 and the Sega Genesis. By the time the Super Famicom was ready to be launched, Sega was starting to take a lead in the gaming industry. With a good amount of games in its library, NEC was no slouch either. Nintendo, for the first time, had to deal with true competition. This marked one of the greatest console wars in history: Sega versus Nintendo. Nintendo released the Super Famicom in 1990 in Japan, and it instantly sold out of the 300,000 units that were made. The system was then released in North America under the name Super Nintendo in 1991. Also around this time, Nintendo was aware of the CD add-on that Sega was about to release and wanted one for their own Super NES system, so it could stay competitive. They had contracted out with Sony to develop the CD add-on named, you guessed it, the PlayStation. However, during the CES show in 1991, Nintendo reneged on their deal with Sony to produce it and went with Philips. Possibly one of the worst mistakes Nintendo ever made, birthing a monster in the gaming industry to this day, Sony's PlayStation. Philips went on to develop the CDI when Nintendo discontinued the CD add-on, but Philips still had a contract with Nintendo. This is why we have those weird CDI Zelda and Mario games like Hotel Mario and Zelda's Adventure. Once again, Nintendo had a lot of publishers developing for it, and unlike the Genesis, the games could be enhanced with special chips in the carts for sound and graphics. Also, it was capable of pseudo 3D graphics. During this time, sales of the system skyrocketed. As most older gamers used the Genesis, younger gamers chose the SNES. This was all part of the console war. This is a strategy that worked atop Sega then, but would not work on future consoles, as it was shown by Sony's marketing of the PS1 to older gamers in the market, while Nintendo was still marketing to kids with the N64. The SNES went on to sell just under 50 million units worldwide, being launched in 1990 in Japan and finally being discontinued in the UK in 2005, giving this system an amazing 15-year lifespan. making it one of the longest lasting game systems to ever hit the market.
Wanted more power, arcade-like 4-dimensional graphics, and 15-channel stereo sound. Neo-Geo is no stopping us now.
The story of the Neo-Geo starts in the early 1970s. In 1973, businessman and former boxer Eikichi Kawasaki acquired an electronic engineering company and renamed it Shin Nihon Kikaku, which means a New Japan project in Japanese. There's not much information on what the company produced during this time, but it is thought that they made electronic components and parts. As the 1970s rolled along, Kawasaki saw that the coin-op arcade business was growing and wanted to be part of it. On July 22, 1978, the company reorganized and became Shin Nihon Kikaku Corporation and started designing coin-op arcade games. That same year, their first game was produced. It was a clone of the popular arcade game Breakout called Mekon Kit. They produced a series of these games, with one called Battleship Yamato, based on the popular anime series Space Battleship Yamato. In 1979, they released a Space Invaders type game called Ozma Wars. And in 1980, Safari Rally was released, a maze-type game. By 1981, SNK was doing well and decided to open up operations in the US in Sunnyvale, California, to distribute their machines in the North American market. They hired on John Rowe to run operations in the US. Also, in 1981, SNK released their first successful game, Vanguard. It was distributed by Century and Cinematronics in North America and by SNK themselves in Japan. It was a scrolling shooter like Scramble or Super Cobra, but with differences that made it stand out and made gameplay fun and addictive. After the success with Vanguard, SNK went on to create over 20 more arcade machines up to 1986. The most popular of these was Akari Warriors. It was so popular that it was ported to several home computers and game consoles such as the Commodore 64, Atari 2600, and the NES. It was during this time that John Rowe left SNK to form Tradewest and was replaced by Paul Jacobs. In 1985, SNK opened a second American branch called SNK Home Entertainment. It also became an official third-party licensee for Nintendo's Famicom and NES. In 1988, SNK started to design a new type of arcade machine. It would be based off SNK and Alpha Dinshi's own M68000 arcade boards using the Motorola 68000 processor. SNK took it a step further with their version, the SNK M68000, which added enhancements to the original SNK Alpha Dinshi board. From here, Alpha Dinshi engineer Eiji Fukatsu created what was called the Neo-Geo hardware. He added more enhancements to the SNK M68000, such as the Yamaha YM2610 FM sound chip with dedicated sound RAM and a Z80 coprocessor for sound. On top of that, sprite scaling was added and stored on ROM in scaling tables, and support for more memory was added. It was also capable of playing more than one game that the user could choose from, calling it the MVS or Multiple Video System, a similar idea that Nintendo had with its Player's Choice cabinets. Which, speaking of Nintendo, SNK released its first home console game made specifically for the NES and was not an arcade port. This was Baseball Stars. This was followed by Crystalis in 1990. By 1990, SNK created another division of the company called Neo-Geo, which all the MVS technology would fall under. Development of the new MVS machine was finished and the system was released. It was the first system to use the name Neo-Geo. The MVS part of the system was essentially designed by Takashi Nishiyama and featured either 1, 2, 4, or 6 game configurations. The games themselves were relatively cheap at $500 a piece, saving arcade owners money from buying multiple machines for thousands and saving floor space in the arcades by having several games in one cabinet. This made the MVS system very popular with arcade owners, and the amazing games made it popular with the gamers. Some of the early MVS games included Baseball Stars Professional, Nom 1975, Top Players Golf, and Ninja Combat. After saying for years that they didn't want to enter the console market, they did. The Neo-Geo AES, or Advanced Entertainment System, was developed from the MVS system using the same components minus the multiple cartridge slots. As advanced as the AES was, it came with a price. Being released in Japan first in 1990 and then in North America in 1991 for the price of $649.99. That was a lot of money then. In fact, with inflation, that comes to just over $1,500 in 2024 money. Just crazy expensive, and priced a lot of people out of buying one. But this was never intended to be marketed to the consumer. When it released, it was supposed to be sold to commercial customers for use as rentals, such as at hotels and motels. However, people that played the systems liked them so much, they were willing to pay the huge amount of money for the experience of the arcade at home. It was at this point that SNK changed their marketing strategy for the AES and expanded the marketing to the regular consumer. SNK didn't want to give the consumer a dumbed-down arcade experience like other console manufacturers of the time like Nintendo and Sega were doing. They wanted to give people the true arcade experience at home, and really that's just what they did. The games were the exact same games that were in the arcade. They even developed a memory card that could be used between the AES and the MVS systems for game saves and character saves. Gamers loved the console, if they could afford it. At the time, it was considered the best console you could buy. I was a teenager at the time, and I can tell you everybody was talking about this console. But nobody had one. It was like the holy grail of gaming, and Neo Geo knew it. Marketing was just a couple of low-budget commercials telling you where to buy it. They had no intention of throwing a bunch of money into its commercials or its marketing.
You wanted more power, arcade-like four-dimensional graphics, and 15-channel stereo sound. Neo Geo is no stopping us now.
But time waits for nobody, including game consoles. As technology advanced and the next-gen consoles were due to come out, such as the PlayStation and the Saturn, in 1994 they released the Neo-Geo CD in Japan. This console was released as a cost savings to the consumer. Instead of having to buy the pricey AES cartridges, now you could have the same games but on the cheaper CD format. But even before it launched, complaints about its load times became a huge issue. The Neo Geo CD was released in North America in 1996, but sales were slow. The Neo Geo was being passed over for the 3D graphics of the PS1, N64, and the Saturn. Plus, Sega's next-gen 3D system was on the horizon, the Dreamcast. The end was knocking on the door for the Neo Geo. In 1997, both the AES and the Neo Geo CD were discontinued. NVS production lasted a little while longer, but ended as well. Well, that brings us to the end of the Neo Geo story. The Neo Geo will always be known for being a powerhouse in the early 1990s console market. Some say this console was the beginning of the end for the arcade. Do you guys agree with that? The Neo Geo had a 7-year lifespan, from 1990 to 1997, selling just under 1 million units with the AES and CD combined.
Hey! You still don't have a Sega CD? What are you waiting for, Nintendo to make one? You have seen the games, right? Wrong answer, man. Show 'em! Want to see more?
The story of the Sega CD really starts in Japan in 1988. NEC was rumored to release a CD-ROM based system by the end of the year. Sega had just released the Sega Mega Drive in Japan to compete with the 16-bit PC Engine. But NEC was looking to step up the game with an add-on to the PC Engine called the PC Engine CD-ROM. Sega knew that the CD-ROM was the media of the future and decided to develop its own add-on CD-ROM system for the Sega Mega Drive. Sega did not have the capability to make its own CD-ROM system, so it partnered with JVC to help. Sega enlisted Tomio Tamaki to lead this project. Sega wanted a CD-ROM based system that could match or even outperform the PC Engine CD-ROM. They originally decided to double the amount of RAM that the NEC version had, but this was not enough. Rumors started to fly that NEC was developing a different, more powerful CD add-on that was to be called the Super CD-ROM that would have up to 512 kilobytes of RAM. Sega upped the ante and decided to put 6 megabits of RAM into this system. But that was not all. They also decided to add another Motorola 68000 CPU, but clocked at 12.5 MHz, almost twice the speed of the Mega Drive CPU. On top of this, they added a custom GPU that could perform scaling and rotation effects. Also, not to be outdone with audio, they included a custom Riot sound chip that was capable of producing 10 channels of sound of audio, partnered with what the Mega Drive's YM2612 and SN76489 chips were providing for the system sound. The system would be able to play games, audio CDs, CDG video discs, and karaoke discs. The Mega CD was released in December of 1991 in Japan with only 2 games, Heavy Nova and Soul Feast. Other games released later that month included Nostalgia 1907, Ernest Evans, Funky Horror Band, and Tenka Fabu. But it wasn't until months later that games really started to hit the market. This led to sales in Japan being strong at first, but dying off quickly because the system really didn't have a great library at launch. During the development of the system, Sega was very protective of the technology that went into it. In fact, they were so secretive about it, they didn't even release a real version to Sega of America until it was almost too late. Sega of America had to procure its own ROM to put into the dummy unit to make it functional. To their dismay, the system had some major issues. The CD drive tray mechanism was flimsy and prone to break, but the worst issue was with the CD drive mech itself drawing too much current and releasing magic smoke from the system's capacitors. Rumor has it that the units actually caught on fire, but this is truly just a rumor. Only the caps blew, causing the system to smoke. The system was revised and released in North America as the Sega CD. When the Sega CD released in North America in October of '92, it was promised to have at least 20 games at launch, but Sega was not able to do this. It launched with 4 games. Unlike Japan, games started to be made right away, and by the end of the year there were 15 games published. The reception of the system is mixed. The system itself and the technology behind it was good, but the lack of games at launch time and the overuse of full motion video really didn't appeal to too many people. As time went on, the system never really caught on, but many great games were made for it. Also, games like Night Trap and Lethal Enforcers were instrumental at the beginning of the ESRB ratings for video games due to their sexual and violent content. The Sega CD was released in Japan in 1991 and discontinued in 1996, giving the console a 5-year lifespan. Although it seemed to be unpopular, it did sell over 2.2 million units with a total of 205 games being made. In my eyes, that's a pretty successful system for an add-on.
Game